with a state. What do you think he might do here? Yeah, he is. This time we see Jackson act completely differently. Jackson is not about to allow, a rogue state to do whatever they want. He's not about to allow a state like South Carolina or any other to just pick and choose whatever laws they want to follow. So Jackson is going to be furious with this whole thing. He's furious with South Carolina. He's, and the whole thing, as I mentioned yesterday, is quite tense because Calhoun, who's the one who's behind a lot of it, who's really nudging South Carolina, he's not publicly leading it, but everybody knows it. He's Jackson's vice president, so there's some tension going on there as Jackson doesn't support any of this and certainly sees this as defiance of his authority. So the way that the nullification crisis is dealt with is there's kind of two things that are done at once. Congress is going to pass two laws at the same time. One of those is what's called the force bill. And just from its name, what do you think that's going to suggest? Yeah, this would authorize the president to use force to enforce the tariff. This would give him the ability, or gives congressional authorization for him to use force to, to impose the tariff. So not exactly sending forces into South Carolina to go, declare war on them or anything, but to use force to actually make sure the tariff is collected and make sure that those duties are actually being paid, all of that. So it authorized him to do that. While it is not let's go invade South Carolina and, just go start shooting at people, it's not that. If they are talking about using force, that would still be seen as, a possibly threatening action. It could cause further problems. So we have that possibility. At the same time, they do this the exact same time, they pass these two things together. Congress also passes through what we call a compromise tariff, or the compromise tariff. Once again, the architect behind that was Henry Clay. Remember Henry Clay from Kentucky? We, a couple of days ago, talked about another compromise that Henry Clay had something to do with. Which was that? The Missouri Compromise. Remember I said then after the Missouri Compromise, Henry Clay gets a reputation for being this kind of great compromiser, that there are multiple compromises that he orchestrates. This is another one of them. This adds to that reputation of him being a compromiser. The compromise tariff lowers the tariff, so it would lower it to a rate that might be considered more acceptable for South Carolina. It doesn't get rid of it. It is still keeping it the same for everyone, but it is putting it back down to some levels that they hope South Carolina will be more accepting of. So it is doing both of these things at once, saying here's one option of we use force to collect the tariff, or we can lower the tariff altogether. So basically in essence, what Jackson's doing here by signing both of these into law is putting the ball back in South Carolina's court and saying, which one are we going to have? Which one are you going to do? Supposedly, he makes the statement of, with one hand I offer you war, and with the other hand I'll offer you peace. Now, which one are you going to choose? Allowing them to decide what they're going to accept. What do you think South Carolina's going to do? They accept the compromise. So, South Carolina accepts the compromise, and crisis averted. So they accept that compromise tariff, and they back down. They revoke their, ordinance of nullification, withdraw that, and they stop their talk of secession, and we seemingly have a restoration of peace and good relationships and all of that. The interesting thing about the nullification crisis is that both sides claim that they won. But South Carolina sees this as a victory, and they will claim that they came down on the winning side in the nullification crisis. But Jackson also claims that he won, and the federal government won. How could South Carolina claim that they won this whole thing? They got the federal government to lower the tariffs. They got the federal government to kind of listen to their issues and lower the tariff to something that was more acceptable to them. How come Jackson could feel like he won? got them to one accept some kind of a tariff, so we still have the law in force, and prevented them from seceding. And he didn't have to actually accept their nullification. At no point did he actually have to concede that their nullification was legitimate. So both sides say that they win, and that's a debate you can continue to have. The significance of the nullification crisis, it demonstrates a lot of things, and it leaves a lot of questions that some may have felt that it answered, but it actually leaves a lot of questions. What does this tell us about sectionalism? It's still there, even though we're past that era of good feelings by this point. But this definitely shows just how difficult and how tense those sectional differences can be, just how volatile this situation is. Here we have a state threatening to secede over an issue that might sound kind of frivolous or, tariffs. It's, we know where all this eventually goes, but those are not even, some of the biggest of sectional differences. We really haven't even gotten too much, the slavery question is definitely a part of this, but that's going to get even more agitated as time goes along. And truly, the nullification crisis on the surface seems like it's all about tariffs and slavery has nothing to do with it, but it really does. Calhoun himself would say that. Ultimately, that's his argument, is that tariffs would make slavery unsustainable and they wouldn't be able to afford it anymore. But we know that these sectional tensions run very, very deep. And this is kind of a foreshadowing of perhaps the things that are to come, just about 30 years after this. And it may not surprise you, and many of you know, when it does come down to the beginnings of actual secession, South Carolina will be the first one. Maybe try to make good on some promises that they didn't make or didn't follow through with right here. So it definitely shows us that tension has not gone anywhere. And in fact, that it is perhaps becoming deeper, perhaps becoming even more volatile. What does this show us about Jackson as his style of leadership? Yeah, he kind of is his way or nothing sort of a guy. Jackson did believe, and I've already mentioned this, the president should be a leader. The president should act on their own convictions. And the president was not just a tool for what Congress wanted them to do. We're going to see that more in the third crisis we're going to look at in just a few minutes with the bank war. And some people might see that as good and some people might see that as bad. I mean, that can be looked at either way. Some people saw that as good and that, we're able to handle a crisis and deal with it. Others saw Jackson as, exercising way too much power, that he was doing what he wanted to do, that he was compromising on his own principles. And, you can make that argument that he chooses federal power when it suits him and then it favors the states when it doesn't, that he kind of just doesn't really follow a particular set of principles, that he follows just what he wants to do. Again, some people might argue that's not a bad thing, but that was quite concerning to many others. So the nullification crisis, we almost get Civil War about 30 years too early, but we do smooth things over, but the idea hasn't gone anywhere. And that's another thing, is that the questions that led to this about whether or not states have a right of secession, whether or not states have a right of nullification, that argument, that's still going on. The nullification crisis did not put an end to any of that. It did not answer those questions. Jackson would say that, yes, we've answered the question, you don't have this ability, but your nullifiers say that they do, because both sides feel that they won here. So there hasn't been a punctuation mark put on some of those questions about whether or not secession is legal, or whether or not nullification is legal. All those things still remain. The third of the major crises that happens during the Jackson presidency is what we call the bank war. Since it is called the bank war, what is this going to have to do with? This has to do with that national bank. The second bank of the United States is its official name. So that's the National Bank. That's what it's actually called. Remember that this had been reinstituted, had been, revitalized, reauthorized as part of that American system. And it had ignited some of the same questions that had ignited before. And we already looked at that with the whole McCulloch versus Maryland case. So by this point, it's been around for a little while. The court has already ruled it constitutional. But that still does not mean that the dispute over it goes away. It's not like after McCulloch, everybody that didn't like the bank just gives up on it. There were still a lot of people that disagreed with the whole concept of the national bank, distrusted the national bank, and overall saw the national bank as a corrupt institution. And even after McCulloch, there are still those that would argue that it was unconstitutional. So we continue to get a debate over this national bank. And Andrew Jackson is one of those people that has a very strong opinion about the national bank. So Jackson becomes a voice for opposition to the national bank and makes no mistake about making sure people know that, about being very vocal about the fact that he does not like the national bank. Jackson and others that agreed with him argue that the national bank is too powerful. It is too big and too powerful. It has too much control. It is like a big monopoly over banking and over the money. And banking is a difficult concept, and part of their opposition may come from the fact that banking is a hard concept, and therefore a lot of people did not trust it. It seemed too risky because some of it just didn't make sense to a lot of folks that weren't familiar with it. But overall, to simplify that argument, that it just had too much control, that it was corrupt, and that the people making decisions about the bank were making decisions really for themselves. Because the thing about the national bank at this point in time was it is a government institution, but it is also partially controlled by private investors. And those private investors, just like any other kind of business, ultimately what do those investors want? Money. And how do they make money? Yeah, but I guess that's a bad question. What I mean is, they're interested in profit, right? So the criticism that Jackson has is that the people controlling that bank are only trying to make themselves richer. They are only concerned with their own wealth. They're not concerned about what's good for the country. They're not concerned about what's good for everybody. And that the bank benefits the wealthy. It benefits the wealthy. It benefits the people that are at the tip top of the economic ladder. It is those really, wealthiest of people are the only ones that benefit from this. And who are the people that Jackson supposedly supports and loves and that love him? It's the common man. And are they going to have anything to do with this national bank? No, they don't benefit from that. And so again, it's a very seen as an elitist institution. It's for the rich people. It hurts the common man. It doesn't give them a shot at things. It's all the rich getting richer and all that. And Jackson does think that it's unconstitutional as well. Although his main argument against it was that it was just too big and powerful, that it was undemocratic, doesn't help the common man, it's an elitist institution. How do they get what? Well, just because there wasn't a bank doesn't mean there wasn't a treasury. There was always a treasury where there was money. Now, as far as you're talking about printing paper money, that was still done even with a national bank. That was still done rather haphazardly. That was still done by individual states. Sometimes it was authorized by the national government, but it could be different for different states. It can be a little bit confusing. But paper money was not done all the time. That was not a constant thing. You were mainly with gold and silver pieces. So paper money was only issued in times of economic crisis usually. We don't get off the gold standard until the 20th century. So it's not as much paper money. So when it was issued by individual banks. It can be rather confusing. Now, there are those that say the national bank is important, the national bank is necessary, the national bank is the reason for all of this economic growth and expansion that we have been experiencing over this era of good feelings and into the Jackson era, and they were right about that. Now, this person, Nicholas Biddle, he was the president of the National Bank. So as the president of the National Bank, he becomes sort of the face of it and becomes the face and the voice of those that supported the bank. And so when this argument over the National Bank erupts, it's sort of seen as a kind of fight between, yes, Jackson and the bank, but between Jackson and Biddle, since Biddle is the president of the bank. It sort of puts a face with it. And there's all kinds of pictures and cartoons of the two of them fighting it out and all this kind of stuff. It's the bank that he's fighting, but this kind of gives a a personal, this guy was talking about it, and was, against Jackson in it. But as far as for Nicholas Biddle and those others like him that supported the bank and thought that it was a good thing, they would argue that the National Bank stabilized things, that it stabilized the economy, that it kept things more even, that it sort of cushioned the ups and the downs of the economy, because that's what the economy does. Things go up, things go down. It does, it just is a constant circular flow, kind of a model thing. That's always going to happen, but they would argue that the National Bank made those ups and downs not quite so drastic, that we don't have these huge highs where things are just kind of getting out of control, and then it all comes crashing down, and you end up in what these days they call a panic, with businesses failing and banks closing and all of that it was kind of a regulatory force. They would argue that the bank and all the money that's putting into the system, that's the reason why the United States economy had grown so significantly up to this point. They were right about that. That had provided for economic growth. That was why you had the economic expansion that you had after the War of 1812. And they argued that in this more modern economy, in a more industrialized economy, a market-based economy, which is what the United States was turning into, that you needed to have a strong and stable financial system. And if you get rid of the bank, then the financial system can be quite chaotic, and you're going to have all kinds of economic panic and all of that. So it comes down to a fight over the bank and whether or not it's good or bad. And you can see that sort of class thing in there as well, with Jackson arguing that this harms the common man. He paints it as a rich person institution, and he's going to fight for democracy and the common people against this corrupt, evil bank that's just trying to control everything and make people rich. Well, this gets forced as a campaign issue when Jackson's running for re-election. The bank bill, this was the bill that would reauthorize the bank again, renew it. Okay, because like I said before, the National Bank, like a lot of things, it has to be renewed or reauthorized every so often or it goes away. It's not supposed to expire for several more years, but what some of Jackson's opponents decide to do, really Henry Clay was the guy behind this, is they decide to bring up this bank bill, the bank's reauthorization, a little bit early to try to force Jackson to take action against it. They're kind of baiting him. They are assuming that Jackson, for all his talk, that he would be far too timid and he wouldn't dare actually get rid of the bank, that would be so economically devastating that he wouldn't dare actually do that. So they force this a little bit early, try to make it a campaign issue, something that Jackson's going to have to campaign on, and then sort of bait him with this bank bill and, give him, either force him to accept it because they assume that he will have to, because either the economic consequences would be too great, but also because, okay, here's the thing, if Jackson can sign this, in which case he looks pretty ridiculous because he's, talked so bad about the bank, and if he reauthorizes it, now it looks like he's going against that, and he's going against the common man and all that stuff. What's his other option? He could veto it. Well, here's the thing. Our understanding of the veto is very different than what their understanding of the veto was, partially because of what Jackson does with this bank bill. The veto power at this point in time was used very, very sparingly. It had not been used by too many presidents. It was really seen as an emergencies only kind of a thing. Imagine the veto as sort of like the fire extinguisher or something that's more of in movies and stuff, there'd be like an axe on the wall to like bust open the fire extinguisher thing, like emergencies only kind of stuff. It's kind of like that. The veto was meant to be used only if Congress had done something that was just so horrible and unconstitutional that they had to be blocked. It was not about just what was good or bad. It was about legal or illegal, constitutional or not constitutional, not like or not like. So they're kind of trying to bait Jackson into something that they think he's going to look bad no matter what he does. So this becomes a big national issue. I said it, inspires lots of different cartoons and pictures, and it's all over the papers. Here's just a few examples. So this one, we see Andrew Jackson. How is he dressed? Like a king? Do you think that's meant to be a compliment, or is that a criticism? That's criticizing him. What are they saying about him? He's being like a monarch, which in these days would have been far even more concerning probably to people then than it is even to us, because these are folks that were, still but a generation or so, not even removed from, England and this anti-monarchy kind of stuff. So having him dressed like a king is like having him dressed like a dictator, basically, and he's just doing what he wants to do and not following the law. Can you read what's in his hand right here? Veto. So the threat he's using to veto that bank bill. Can you tell what he's standing on here? Let's see what that says. Constitution. And what's happened to the Constitution? It's all ripped up and he's standing on it. So is this criticizing Jackson's actions toward the bank? Yes, this is saying if he vetoes that bank bill, or when he does veto that bank bill, he's acting like a dictator, breaking the law, has no respect for the Constitution, and this is an overextension of presidential power. Then you've got stuff like this, which looks a little weirder. Here's Jackson here, okay? And it says, General Jackson slaying the many-headed monster. So what do you think this monster is supposed to represent? Not Congress. The bank. This represents the bank. Notice some of the, top hats, fancy-looking people. And these do represent specific people. I think this might be middle right there. I can't quite remember. But some of them are also other congressmen, investors, people that benefited or that supported the bank. You can't read it, I'm sure, but Jackson's sword here says veto on it. So, in vetoing the bank, what is Jackson doing? He's killing this powerful, evil being that, is only hurting the public. And this is a very democratic kind of thing. And notice here how he looks. Very different, from this. Not just the way he's dressed, but how else is he kind of depicted here besides his clothing? Looks more common, looks kind of grandfatherly even, looks sort of friendly. Sort of this heroic stance. So you have this from the side that saw Jackson's dislike of the bank as a very democratic, pro-common man kind of a thing. There's also one, this one's hard to read, I see, but here we got Jackson. This one actually refers to what Jackson's going to do a little bit later. So I'm going to come back to that one and show you that one in a second, because it'll make more sense after we see what Jackson actually does. So they put that bank bill on Jackson's desk, kind of baiting him to see what he'll do, kind of thinking that he's going to get sort of critiqued or get in trouble for whatever he does. What do you think Jackson's going to do with that bank bill? He vetoes it. So Jackson vetoes the bank bill, which means that the bank's not going to be reauthorized. It's still got several more years of life left before it expires, but it's not going to be reauthorized after that. The thing about that veto of the bank bill, as I was saying a moment ago, the veto in these days was seen as something that was to be used very sparingly. That it was not about what the president wanted, it was about blocking something that they believed was truly unconstitutional. Jackson, while he does kind of think the bank is unconstitutional, what's the real reason he's vetoing this? He doesn't like it. He doesn't think this is helpful. And he is saying, I am the decider. I get to pick that, not the Supreme Court. The president decides those kinds of things. And so his veto, his use of the veto, was a big expansion of presidential power. It's the first time the veto is used that way. It is the first time that the president vetoes something really more out of personal conviction than anything else, because he did not agree with it. And he is also arguing that as the president, that's part of his job, is to be the decider, that it's not the court's place to say that all the time, that the president has that kind of authority as well. And that changes the perception, of the veto from then on. It still doesn't get used a ton. It gets used by more presidents than others. But our perception of it more is that the president does have the authority to act on their own conviction. That if there's something that they don't like, don't agree with, think is harmful, that they have the ability to use the veto to block that. That it's not just about it's illegal or not. And Jackson is one of those presidents, again, as I mentioned before, where the presidency itself is transformed. And that there's a big expansion of presidential power. A lot of that comes from his veto of the bank bill. But Jackson decides that that's not even enough. Because this was a campaign issue. Jackson vetoed the bank bill and he still won re-election. Wins the election to his second term. So Jackson then concludes that must mean people agree with him about the bank. They were with him on that. They support his actions to get rid of the bank. And so he decides he don't want to wait for his charter to actually expire. Because remember, it's actually got a few more years of life left in it. So Jackson decides he wants to go ahead and get rid of it before that. So what he does, how he kills the bank, is he removes the government's money. He has, or actually orders the Secretary of the Treasury to remove the government's deposits from the bank and put them somewhere else, put them into state banks. Because if the government's money isn't in the bank, what can't the bank do? It can't run, it can't make loans, it cannot function if there is no funding in it. So it basically makes it go bankrupt, forces it to go bankrupt, and forces it to go under, and Jackson destroys the national bank that way. Quite the controversial action, won by kind of, getting rid of this institution that was authorized by Congress. Evidence to that is that Jackson had to go through, he has to order the Secretary of the Treasury to do this. He had to go through 3 different people. The first 2, I think it's 3. But the first 2 refused to do it, and Jackson fired him. And so another one came in, he refused to do it. Jackson fired him. I think on the 3rd one, they agreed to do it. So people saw this as, again, an overextend. This is what let me go back just a second. This cartoon here, this scroll that Jackson's holding, it says order for the removal of public funds from the United States banks, and this is specifically referring not so much to his veto, but for his removal of the funds. And these are all columns and such here. What do you think that's supposed to represent? The bank and what's happening to it. It's falling down, and you see all these people running. What kind of people do you think these are? One of them, I think it's supposed to look like a little demon, that some of these people are so bad. What do you notice about some of the other ones? Well, they're rich, they got nice clothes and little money bags and all this sort of stuff. So again, some people saw this as heroic, and Jackson getting rid of that mean old bank that just hurts the common man. Jackson's veto of the bank bill, though, does cause severe economic consequences. It does result in a massive economic downturn known as the Panic of 1837. And we're not going to go into too much detail about it other than a panic. It's, an economic, what we would today either call a recession or a depression, in which businesses are failing, banks are failing, unemployment is high, all those sorts of things. And a lot of people pointed directly to Jackson's dismantling of the national bank as the cause of that, because the national bank suddenly wasn't there anymore to manage currency, to keep the economy stable, as Nicholas Biddle and others had argued. Now Jackson argued that that's not his fault. To him, it just proved, he would say this just proved the national bank had too much control to begin with. He's saying, I told you so, I told you it was too powerful, because look what happened when we don't have it anymore. So he would claim victory nonetheless. So there, in that sense, this was also, a question of federal power versus state power. Who did Jackson seem to side with here? Kind of with the states, but in a way, how is it, could you argue he's arguing for more federal power here? Right, he was deciding that he as the president had the authority to do all such things. So this one, you can kind of see both, that Jackson, kind of just, he's arguing for that this is unconstitutional, the government shouldn't have this kind of power over the finances, but he as the president can get rid of it if he wants to, So it's he's a controversial character and kind of a confusing guy. Kind of hard to tell sometimes what his real convictions are, but I think you can safely say that Jackson believes in Jackson. That Jackson kind of does what he wants to do and believes the president ought to have that kind of authority. Now, the other economic ramifications of all of that, some of it's not felt till after Jackson leaves office, so he does not have to deal with all that just too much, and some of his successors will have to deal with it. But that's the end of the national bank until the 20th century. You won't see that again until progressive era. That will be re-implemented, but in a completely different form. All right. So, any questions? All right, then. So, if you would please, you can get Google Classroom back out.